I've been a learning coach for the past 13 years. I run a learning program called I Can Study, where I've worked with tens of thousands of learners around the world to help them reach their dream results. And I'm going to compress 13 years of studying and learning advice into this one video. Number one, studying does not equal learning. You can spend a lot of time studying and get very little learning out of it. Studying is just the thing that you do. It's the way you write your notes. It's the way you read your book, the way you test yourself. They're the physical activities. We study so that it can produce learning. Learning is the outcome. It's the thing that happens in our brain that connects the dots together, that turns information into knowledge. Learning has only occurred if the information is something that you can remember and you understand it deeply, and then you can apply it in the way that you need to apply it. So if you spend 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours studying, but you don't have good retention, depth of understanding, and the ability to apply that knowledge after spending that time, you didn't learn. You only studied. And it's this understanding that I wish I had 13 years ago when I was desperately trying to enter into medical school and I was studying 20 hours a day, sacrificing sleep, sacrificing friends, sacrificing hobbies, relationships with everyone around me, taking a massive hit to my mental health because I was so sleep deprived, just studying so much that I wish I realized that different methods of studying sit on a spectrum of effectiveness. Some methods produce almost no real learning, like rereading and just like highlighting things. This produces like no real learning. The amount of time you need to spend on that activity and how, in a way, lucky you have to be for that to just accidentally create learning is astronomical. On the other hand, there are other techniques that produce much more learning. And the idea is that we want to get rid of the stuff that doesn't work and replace it with techniques that produce a high amount of learning. And thinking about studying not as just like this thing that you do, and then if you have problems, it's like, oh, I've got problems with my studying, very abstractly, and thinking about it instead as, okay, I'm doing stuff, but how much learning are each of the methods I'm using producing? This shifts the focus. It makes you much more targeted in being able to improve the way you learn. Number two, stop looking for study hacks. Real ones don't exist. If you go on TikTok or Instagram and you search like hashtag studying, studygram, study talk, you will find hundreds of videos of people saying, use this technique and you're going to get 100% on your next test, like guaranteed. And it promises you a lot in like a 30-second, 1-minute video. And these videos get like millions of views because there are millions of people looking for this shortcut to learning. Here's the truth. If you've really been struggling to get better at learning, then the solution is not going to come from a 30-second study hack. If it was that easy to solve, you would have already solved it. And most of the time, yes, sometimes there are little things that can be adjusted and like tiny little tweaks that you can make to the way that you study to make it more effective. But most of the time, the big problems that people have with studying that holds them back from success are rooted in years and years of habits that have just stacked together. And you can't unlearn and retrain that overnight. And so when you focus on study hacks, not only is it just not going to work and you're going to waste your time, but the part that really bugs me is when I sit down with a student and they've been using so many study hacks for so long and they haven't found good results with them, they start believing that they're just not going to be smart enough. I remember I had this one student who, like a really bright, bubbly girl, trying to enter into medical school at the time. She came to my office. We had a consultation together, and I mapped out her whole learning process. And I looked at it and I said, okay, well, based on what you're doing, it seems like you've got these habits that are leading to you doing this kind of studying and thinking in this way, which means that you're probably going to struggle with these sorts of things. And I kind of created a roadmap for her in terms of how she needs to improve. And I was explaining this stuff, and then I looked up at her, and then I can see that she just starts crying. And I thought I'd done something wrong. I was like, damn, was not prepared for this. I asked her what's going on, and she said, I just thought I was dumb. And so She had been using study hacks and tips for so long that she believed in herself that since all these hacks that are promising her great results are not working, therefore the only logical conclusion left must be she's just too dumb. And I think that's a very sad conclusion to make just because you didn't realize the answer doesn't lie in a shortcut. So then the natural question might be, what am I meant to look at instead? So you might look at what successful students are already doing to try to copy them. Which leads me to number 3. Stop copying successful students. And I know this sounds very counterintuitive. If you see someone that's successful and you want to be successful, naturally you think if I just do what they're doing, I'm going to be just as successful. Here's the thing. Learning is a very personalized thing. It's a very personalized process. And what works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for another person. And this is especially true in learning to learn because of something called deep processing. Deep processing is your ability, and a lot of this is determined genetically and early childhood experiences, and you can train it. And this is what I do. It's what we do at I Can Study. We train it, but it does take time. But deep processing is your brain's ability to connect information together and extract meaningful learning out of the information that you're consuming. When you look at someone, you say, man, they're just like a genius. They just read it and they just get it. Everything clicks for them. What their brain is doing to make it click for them, that is deep processing. And again, it's something that can be trained. And the reason this is important for copying successful students is because most successful students are not successful because of the techniques they use. It's not because of how they're studying. It's because they have a level of deep processing that is, in a way, natural. Like they were luckier in a way. And they could get away with using mediocre techniques and still make it work for them. A great analogy is thinking about how a car works. You've got an engine, and if you have a really powerful engine and you just floor it, you don't have to be a great driver. You're going to go really fast. And sure, maybe if you're competing against other people with awesome cars, then you need to have that skill. But just in the general population, most people are not driving supercars. And so if you just even slightly just push down on the pedal, you're going to go fast. So if someone else is in a different car that's not as fast, with a smaller engine, looking at the person driving and trying to copy their technique, shifting the same way, pushing down on the accelerator the same way, everything, the technique, everything is exactly the same. They're not going to go as fast. And this is a very easy thing, is that when you look at what successful students are doing, and I'm not talking about study influencers who, honestly, a lot of the time when they talk about the stuff that they're doing, they're not doing that stuff. They're just making up stuff that they're saying they're doing to create some content for it. But it's when you look at what they actually do in their daily life, they're not doing half that stuff. If you look at what successful students are actually doing, and you just do exactly the same thing, and millions of people do the same exact thing, those millions of people are not all getting that top result. And a lot of that comes down to the deep processing ability. So what you should be doing instead of just copying successful students is figuring out how you can be successful yourself. And like I said, it's personalized. And it doesn't mean that if you don't have good deep processing, that you're never going to be successful. My deep processing is not actually naturally amazing. I remember 13, 14, 15 years ago, especially when I was going through high school, I would look at these people in my class that don't seem to need to study at all. And somehow they're doing so much better than I was. And I was actively trying to do better than them and studying more than them. And that continued when I was trying to get through medical school. It continued into medical school, where there were these people that were just anomalies. And now a lot of people look at me and think of me as an anomaly. When I did my Master of Education, I got the highest grade in the entire year. And I studied for 6 weeks, even less than that. And people would look at that and say, okay, it must be because I'm built different, but it's not. I really actively try to build myself and my deep processing ability to get there. And if that's you, then you really do need to. If your deep processing is not at a certain level, it is very difficult to be a good learner. And so training that becomes a very high priority. And that is not something that already successful students, a lot of them are not doing that. Number 4, stop thinking techniques, start thinking systems. I'll tell you a story. There's a student that I was working with a couple years ago, and they were really, really struggling with their studying for a long time. And this is not just like working with me for a short amount of time. Like they were working with me for like an entire year. So I talked to him and asked him what was going on. I kind of mapped everything out. And what I realized is that he had this belief that there is this best technique and that the perfect technique is the end goal. Once you understand and can use this perfect technique, you don't need the other techniques anymore. It's just you can use that and your problems are all solved. That is not realistic. There is no such thing as the perfect technique. You have to start thinking about techniques like tools. You cannot build an entire house with a screwdriver. It doesn't matter how good your screwdriver is, you just can't do it. Or if you do it, like your hands are bleeding and it took you like 30 years. The idea is that you have to have a toolbox of different tools that you know how to use, and each tool has its own purpose and its own limitations. And the exact same thing is true for learning skills. Each technique or method or strategy has a specific purpose that it's really good for, and then it has limitations. And just because something has limitations doesn't mean you should do what the student was doing and abandon it and say, oh, it must not be good enough, I'm not going to learn that. Use it for what it's good for, and then supplement that with other techniques that fill in those gaps. There's another side to the spectrum here, which is that some students also never think about the limitations in the first place. And so they'll have a technique and they'll believe this technique is like flawless. And so they will then use and abuse it to do everything. And the best example of this is flashcards. A lot of people look at flashcard spaced repetition and active recall, and that is like their whole method of studying. Like they just have flashcards. And if it's not enough, it's not working, then they think, what's the problem? Here's the answer, more flashcards. And that's a situation where you're abusing it. Flashcards are a great technique for a specific purpose. But if you use it for something it's not good for, you're not going to get good results. You're wasting time. You're burning efficiency. Now, as we have established, if you want to become a better and more productive learner, you need to upgrade your entire learning system. And when I say this, a lot of students will come up to me and say, well, Justin, I don't even have a learning system. However, that is not true. Most students have a learning system. It's just not refined. And so it's like most students have a toolbox of sorts to begin with. It's just that it may not be full of like premium top of the line tools that they need to excel at the top level. Now, a high leverage activity that you should do is to have your toolbox assessed by an expert. This helps you to figure out which of your tools is the weakest, but more importantly, where you should invest your time in first to get the biggest improvements in your results. Now, this is something that I do all the time. And if I could see you in person, then I could give you a consultation, map out your learning toolbox, tell you where you need to work on, and just do that for you on the spot. But I only have so much time. And it would also be kind of weird for me to just rock up to your house unannounced, just like offer you a learning toolbox evaluation. But to still help you, I've actually created a free learning toolbox assessment for you. It's a quiz that evaluates your entire learning system and then even gives you a score out of 100. More importantly, it also gives you a personalized report at the end, which tells you exactly which parts of your learning system are holding you back and therefore what you should work on. It's absolutely free, and I'll leave a link in the description for you below. Now let's move on back to our next study lesson. Number 5, avoid the illusion of learning. What is the illusion of learning? The illusion of learning is when you do something that makes you feel like you're learning, but you're not. And this is basically the learning equivalent of productive procrastination. So one of the things we're probably all guilty of is, when there's something that you need to do, like a big task, and you procrastinate, but you procrastinate doing things that feel productive, like organizing your room or like cleaning up your desk or something like that. or, just planning, like creating a schedule. And it's not the most important thing for you to do. Really, what you need to do is just get on and do the task. But we procrastinate with these other things that feel like we're making progress. And we do that because it's easy and it makes us feel better about the fact that we're making progress. And so that's basically what the illusion of learning is. It's when you're doing something and it makes you feel good because it's like, I guess this is helping me with learning. But when you actually go to measure it, it's probably not helping. And there's two really common examples I see in students that I work with. The first one is in just writing and rewriting notes. The amount of times that I've spoken to someone, mapped out their learning, and then they have a 1 hour lecture followed by 2-3 hours of writing notes. But then at the end of those 2-3 hours, they haven't learned anything. I say, well, if you were to sit a test right now, how well do you think you'd do? They say, well, terribly, because I haven't learned it yet. I've just written my notes. Why did you spend 3 hours writing notes and doing stuff if it's not helping you with learning? And a lot of the time, the answer is that it's just what they're used to doing. It's comfortable. It's an existing habit, and they don't know what else to do. They don't know how to really create effective learning. So they hide in the comfort of the illusion, just saying, I'm sure if I just do this, it will help with my learning somehow, even though when you really look at it, that it's not helping with your memory and your retention and your depth of understanding, your ability to apply it. And so if you're trapped in the illusion of learning, the answer is not just like feel terrible and panic and stay in the illusion of learning. It's to accept that you're doing something that's frankly kind of useless and learn about the alternatives. There are other things that you can do, and not knowing what to do is not a good excuse. And I don't mean to call you out, and I don't mean to upset you with saying that, but I think if you really want to give yourself the best chance of success, sometimes you do have to look at things as like, this is the cold, hard truth. Now, one of the things that you can do to break out of the illusion of learning and do something that's a little bit more effective is number 6, test yourself earlier and more often. I remember for most of my life, especially high school, I would study for an exam. And then by the time I'm entering into the exam, I really don't know how well I'm going to do. Like usually I would know that I'm going to pass and I'm probably not going to do like too badly, but I have to wait for the result to find out. And that sounds completely natural. But actually, there isn't a good reason not to know how well you're going to do in an exam before you walk in. And if you don't, that probably means you're not testing yourself early enough and often enough. How I used to study, and this is how a lot of people study, is that you'll just spend time like studying and reading and writing notes. And then like a week or two before the exam, I'm doing practice tests. Or sometimes it's like the night before the exam. I'm just doing like practice papers and I'm finding these gaps and I'm getting used to applying my knowledge and I'm going into the exam. And here's the thing is that let's say you test yourself and then you find all these gaps. You don't really have time to fill any of them anymore. And in fact, I've even worked with students that deliberately avoid testing themselves with harder questions because they know they won't be able to answer it. It's like, you're still going to have to answer it in the exam anyway. The point is, you have to find these gaps by testing yourself as early as possible. And one of the changes that I made that really helped with my exam results and my exam confidence is just testing myself at the end of every week, at the end of every month. So on the Saturday, I would test myself on everything I learned from Monday to Friday. And then on the Saturday of every month, I would test myself on everything I learned during that month, which meant that number one, I was finding gaps early, but the number of gaps I was finding was not that large because I was only having like a few days worth of learning to review. So it didn't take that long to fill those gaps. And then by the end of the month, I'd already filled a lot of those gaps. And so by the time I would enter into an exam, I would generally know where I'm at. Like if I didn't have enough time to study or I knew that I didn't really quite understand a certain thing, I knew I'm probably going to lose a couple marks on that. So I could guess how my exam result was going to be fairly accurately. But if you're going into an exam either not knowing or feeling confident, and the result is very different from what you expected, then you're either not testing yourself early enough and often enough, or you're testing yourself in the wrong way. And so what is the right way to test yourself? Number 7, test at each level of knowledge. I talk about this concept of levels of knowledge very often in a lot of my other videos, like Bloom's Revised Taxonomy. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of depth right now, but basically knowledge can be divided into different levels. At the low levels, it's just memorization, regurgitation, just being able to explain something. It's very, very isolated. At the higher levels, you can use concepts together. You can see how they connect and influence each other. So it means that when you get a tricky question, you can look at that question and you can dissect it. You can pull apart which concepts are relevant, how you need to connect them together to arrive at an answer. And so one of the mistakes that I used to make is I was predominantly testing myself at a low level, and a lot of my studying was at a low level anyway, even though I knew I was going to be tested at a higher level. So I knew that there were going to be questions that asked me to discuss a web of concepts together where I need to use knowledge in a very interconnected way, in a more complex, more nuanced kind of application. But I would only test myself like with flashcards, answering individual like single questions. And I never tested like whether I can actually do that higher level of thinking. And lo and behold, I sit an exam. Which questions do I struggle with the most? The complicated ones. So just think to yourself, how am I going to be tested on this? How do I need to use my knowledge? And make sure that you are testing yourself in that same way so you can find the gaps that are relevant to you. Number 8, test yourself in different ways. So let's say you're learning to play tennis. Then there's a theory of understanding how to play, understanding the rules, knowing technically how you're meant to do a serve and do your forehand and backhand. But then there's the ability to actually do it. And it's understanding the tiny, tiny little nuances where, I guess theoretically you could learn that through a textbook, but realistically it's just be overwhelming. It's like how you'd position your foot, exactly how you arch your back when you do a serve, where you're looking. These tiny, tiny little things that allow you to execute on what you know. And so the first one, which is the theory, is the what. That's called declarative knowledge. And the second one, which is being able to do it, the how, that's called procedural knowledge. And in a lot of subjects, you need both. Great example is maths or physics, where there is a declarative knowledge set of the concepts and understanding what things are and being able to define things and being able to look at a question and say, okay, I can understand what relevant concepts there are and how I can chain them together. That's the declarative knowledge. But then you have to actually be able to solve the problem, like use the formula and do the right equations and know how to use the equations correctly. And that's the procedural part. Same thing in software engineering or coding, where you can understand how to use the code, technically what the language is and how to use different parts of it. And then there's the ability to actually write good bug-free code. The problem arises when you only focus on one of them. A great example, again, is maths, where maths is often really heavily focused on the procedural knowledge. So people spend most of their time just like solving problems and just doing equations. So when they get a question that requires them to think about it a bit more conceptually, maybe it's a little bit more abstract, they don't really know how to approach it because they have never thought about the concepts behind it. And so that will be a failure of not really learning and then testing yourself in the declarative type of knowledge. And you don't always need both types. Like some subjects like biology, for example, are often very just like declarative concept focused. But you do need to test yourself, again, in the way that you know you're going to be tested, to see whether you have gaps in your declarative or procedural knowledge part. And so once you test yourself often and in different levels and with a balance of declarative and procedural, like actually doing stuff as well, then you'll find gaps. Now, the question is, what do you do with the mistakes you make? Number 9, assume you'll make every mistake again. I think one of the most common and detrimental myths about learning is something I call silly mistake syndrome. It is the belief that the reason you got it wrong is a silly mistake. But here's the thing. It's probably not. Truth is, most people do not lose enough marks from silly mistakes for it to really matter. I remember distinctly back when I was in my final year of high school, sitting in the library doing these practice test questions. And what I would do is I would write the answer and then I would check the answer sheet straight away. And then, which by the way, that's not a good technique. And I'd check the answer sheet straight away and then I'd read the answer. And sometimes I'd get it wrong. But it's not because I was completely wrong. It's because there's just like this one point that I missed. But I know the point. I understand it. I already studied it. I just forgot to add that point in that particular answer. And so I'd look at that and I'd say, yeah, that's just a silly mistake. And so I'd do these practice questions and, my test result when I did it would be like 95%. And then I'd sit the actual exam and I'd get like 85%. And I'd look at the answer sheet and be like, man, I just missed those little points. And I used to think that that was because of me making silly mistakes until I realized there are still people who are not making silly mistakes. Why am I the one that is suffering from the silly mistakes? Am I just a silly person? And that's when I decided to just assume it's not a silly mistake. Just assume that every time I make a mistake, there's a legitimate reason for me to have made that mistake. There's a real gap in my knowledge. And when I shifted that perspective, what it helped me realize is that when I'm writing something and I missed a point and I look at the answer sheet and I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I already knew that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that I knew and I can understand the answer sheet. If I wasn't able to generate that answer, it means that there's a gap. And I started seeing these tiny misalignments with how I had studied the topic. This point that I'd missed, it's not a silly mistake to have missed it. Now that I really dive deeper, I genuinely didn't really understand why it was so important to add into the answer in the first place. And after studying it a bit more, I realized, okay, actually not having that point doesn't make sense. If I really understood the answer to this, then I would have included it because leaving it out is actually incomplete. And speaking as a coach, there are very, very few times when someone is making a silly mistake while having genuinely good levels of knowledge. The people who make silly mistakes consistently, these are almost always the same people who have gaps in their knowledge. Number 10, do spaced repetition and active recall properly. If you spend any amount of time watching, studying, and learning videos, you will have heard of spaced repetition and active recall. If you haven't, then I'll really quickly summarize it. Spaced repetition is when you take something that you've learned and then you repeat it. You usually test yourself in some kind of spacing interval. So it could be you learn something on one day and then a week later you test yourself and then you test yourself again 2 weeks later and you test yourself, a month later or something like that. And it's effective because of something called the spacing effect, which is basically that your memory is enhanced when you repeat things after a certain wait period. Active recall is when you recall something from your memory. Actually, it's any time you're retrieving knowledge from your memory is technically active recall. So a great example is if someone asks you a question and you answer that question from memory, you're doing active recall. And spaced repetition and active recall are often paired together because a lot of techniques use them together. You do a spaced repetition session using active recall. So for example, if you learn something on Monday and you test yourself with some practice questions and flashcards on Saturday, then that's a spaced active recall session that you're doing. And what most people focus on is just making sure that spacing is really good and hitting their active recall sessions on anything that's due when their app tells them, hey, you need to revise this again. But the truth about learning is that the spacing part is, first of all, easy to do and much less important than the active recall part. And how you do your active recall makes a very big difference to how effective the technique is going to be at producing learning. So there's actually 2 different types of active recall. Arguably, some people say that there's 3. The first one is cued recall. cued recall is when there is a cue, like fill in the blanks or a question prompt that gets you to trigger that memory. Free recall is when you don't have that cue. So something like just writing an essay more openly about a certain topic, that might be something like free recall. If it's a very open-ended question, that will be like free recall. And then there's actually a third type some people say, which is recognition or recognition-based recall, which is you see something and you assess whether you can recognize it or whether it feels like it's a new thing. And the main benefit of active recall comes from the free recall, not the cued recall, and definitely not from recognition. But most people don't realize that these three things are different. Let's say you have a flashcard that asks you a specific question, and then you answer that question. And the answer to that question is like 1 or 2 words. That's cued. What that means is that when you answer that question, what you're training your ability to do is recalling that fact from that cue, which means anytime you're asked about that information without that cue, it becomes harder. And sometimes you can actually tell this happens when you have a flashcard that you've done so many times that without even finishing reading the question, you already know the answer. Like the recall you have is within 2 or 3 seconds. Just you read the first few words and you already remember that the rest of the question goes like this, and therefore this is the answer to it. If you're at that point, you're no longer actually testing on your ability to recall that knowledge. All you're doing is you're testing your ability to match these words to these words. So one thing that you can do, and this is a tip that I give to everyone who's using flashcards, is to swap out your cues. Change your questions regularly, especially the ones that you're consistently getting right. Start changing the actual question you're asking. You can still test on the same concepts or the same facts, but just change the way you're cueing yourself. But the worst one is people that do just recognition, where they'll have a flashcard, they'll try to remember it, and then they can't. But instead of just admitting that you failed to remember it, and often this happens with people that have a ton of flashcards because they know that as soon as they mark it wrong, they're going to have to do that again in like the next few hours. What they do is they just click the answer, they look at the answer, and then they think, oh yeah, that's right. It's like, yeah, we know it's right. It's the answer. So there's no point doing that. Like you that's the ultimate illusion. Like you're tricking yourself into thinking that you know it. You literally just proved that you didn't know it. So if you go and fall into this trap where because you recognized it, you think that means that you can actually recall it, that's a huge red flag. And here's the golden tip. Worry more about how you're doing your active recall than your spacing. When you do really good active recall, you've got more room for error with your spacing. When your active recall method is really bad, very, very cued or even recognition based, then your memory of that is so fragile. You need to repeat that like every 1 or 2 days. Otherwise, you're losing that memory. We call it knowledge decay. Your knowledge decay is very fast. When you have an active recall that induces more learning, then your knowledge decay is slower and your memory is stronger, which means you don't actually have to space it so frequently. You can get away with not looking at it for like 1 or 2 or 3 weeks. So start doing more free recall. Yes, it does take more time and effort, and it's not as brain dead easy as just spamming 100 flashcards. But also, when it comes to learning, you don't really want brain dead. Number 11, rote memorize, but only as a last resort. What is rote memorization? Rote memorization is learning through repetition. It is boring, it is monotonous, it is very tedious. If all you're doing with learning is rote memorization, your life of learning is going to be painful and excruciating and probably not very effective. And for the longest time, most of my learning was just rote memorization. In fact, I didn't even really know that there were other ways of learning. For me, it was just sometimes I can understand it and it will just click and I don't need to rote memorize it because I just get it. But then sometimes I can't get it and then I have to rote memorize it. And so that's not really a technique. That's not a learning system. And the reason rote memorization needs to be a last resort is not because it's not effective. Rote memorization is a tool like any other. And you do need to rote memorize things sometimes. Sometimes there really are things that are so irrelevant where the only reason that you would need to know this is because you're tested on it. And that's not a great, situation to be in. But sometimes you have to rote memorize. But the problem is that it creates a very surface level, very isolated kind of knowledge, which means that you can only use that knowledge in that way, like just regurgitation of words. So if you need to use that knowledge for anything more complicated, like a higher level of knowledge, then rote memorization is not going to be a good tool to use. And I can promise you, you cannot rote memorize your way to success. But there is actually another problem with rote memorization, which is that it is by definition very time inefficient. A lot of rote memorization is repetitive. And just spamming flashcards is a great reason for it. By the way, again, I'm not on a personal, I'm not getting paid by a big mind map to hate on flashcards every chance that I get. It just so happens that it's a great example for a lot of mistakes that people make. When you use flashcards, a lot of people will create flashcards and feel great making flashcards and not realize that for every flashcard they make, you have to pay that back 3, 4, 5-fold in the future. It's debt. You're creating learning debt. And this is another illusion of learning, where you feel good making 100 flashcards, but it didn't really contribute to your learning until you do it. So if it takes you a minute to create a flashcard, for example, you're going to need 5 minutes in the future to answer that. So I used to spend like over an hour every day making flashcards. Then I need 5 hours later in the future to go through and answer them and do them to the point where I'm receiving the benefit of it. Like it's in my memory. But I'm doing that every day. So if I'm doing that 5 days a week, for example, then that's 5 hours of flashcards. I'm now giving myself 25 hours of work to do the next week. And this is why it's very easy to get into this cycle where you're spending hours and hours and hours every single day just doing flashcards. And some of my students are doing 5-6 hours of flashcards a day. And if that sounds extreme to you, you're right. That is extreme. And if that's you, that's a problem. That's not scalable. That's not sustainable. And it's understanding that every flashcard you make is creating debt for yourself. And so you want to minimize that. If you can get away with not having to use repetition, you're saving time. And even if it takes a little bit longer right now to learn it and learn it properly the first time, you should do that rather than just giving that work and multiplying it and letting your future self deal with it. And if you feel overwhelmed right now with your work volume, it's probably because your past self did that to you. One of the students I worked with last year, his name's Tony. He's a chemical materials student from Taiwan. And in Asia, there's this huge culture of rote memorization. It's like a whole thing. And he was, pretty skeptical about doing less rote memorization because he felt like there was no other way that he could learn it. We cut down his rote memorization. So if 100% is everything that he had to learn, he was learning 90% of it through just rote memorization. And so we managed to cut that down just to 70%. And that's only a 20% reduction in the amount that you need to rote memorize. Tony went from studying 60 hours per week to 30 hours per week. We were able to halve the amount of time that he was studying by reducing the amount he was rote memorizing just by 20%. And that's because of the volume scaling issue with rote memorization, is that a small reduction in how much you need to rote memorize has a big impact in the amount of time that you burden yourself with. But let's say we do need to use rote memorization. It's a last resort, but we're at the resort right now. Then how should you do it? Number 12, use flashcards, memory palaces, and link methods for rote memorization. I'm not going to explain each of these different techniques. You can look them up. There's lots of great videos and tutorials about how to use these methods. but they work. They are very, very effective for their purpose. Just make sure to use them for their purpose. Don't abuse them. And remember, it's the last resort. Number 13, study with friends. Sometimes. I remember in my third year of medical school, I was really obsessed with figuring out how I could study with friends. I think part of it might have just been I was like socially deprived from spending so much time either studying or learning to study. And I wanted to kind of spice things up in my life. You can get a sense for what my life was like based on the fact that that was spicy for me. And so I actually ended up doing a lot of experimenting, but also learning about good ways of studying with friends. And what I found is that studying with friends can be really effective, but probably not in the way that most people do them. So there are two main benefits that I found for studying with friends. The first one is for accountability and focus. Especially if you get easily distracted, having friends to keep you focused and keep you accountable can be useful. Unfortunately, sometimes they're the cause of the distraction. So in order for this to work, you actually have to have everyone in that group needs to have the shared purpose and understanding of why you're studying together. Like there has to be like an agenda, like, okay, we all think the same way. We are here to hold each other accountable, to be real with each other, to keep each other focused. And I would highly recommend implementing some kind of system or like structure. Use timers, have like a schedule laid out. Tell people that your responsibility for the session is to keep time or to make sure no one gets distracted. Like assign roles to people. Make it like a job. Take it seriously. I mean, if you're just studying with friends just to like have fun and spice up your life, then you can do whatever. But if it's to really actually make it effective and like promote optimal learning, then create structure. The second benefit of studying with friends, and this is something I almost never see in students like outside of in my program that I'm directly teaching this to, is use your friends to find gaps for each other. So one of the things that I used to do very often is just like quizzing each other. And that's great, but it's not usually sustainable. It's not enough. You can make that into a whole part of your learning system. And this is an awesome technique. Like seriously, so underrated. Make practice tests for your friends as part of the way you do your spaced repetition active recall sessions. I was telling you, like, test yourself at different levels, different ways. Making a practice exam for someone else is a great way of revising, as long as you're trying to make it from memory. And that means that after you've made your exam, you then need to check with your notes to make sure that the exam makes sense. And then you can create your own perfect model answer sheet for the questions that you made, which is great learning. But then by exchanging them with your friends, you now get the questions and perspectives that they made. And if you're trying to make truly challenging questions, then this is like a infinite practice paper glitch. And the best part is that there's no real answer sheet, which sounds like a disadvantage, but it is a massive advantage. Because when you know that there is no answer sheet, you have to check that your answers make sense. You have to be much more critical, reviewing the notes, reviewing your material to make sure that there's nothing missing. And a lot of the time, the answers that you write for your friend's exam will be different to the answer sheet that they made for their own exam. And those points of difference actually become really good areas for discussion. Those usually indicate pretty deep and nuanced gaps in knowledge. And if you get a group of like 3 or 4 friends to do this, then in the time it takes to make one exam and then make an answer sheet, which you're spending that time studying anyway, you now also get 3 extra exams. It is very time efficient, it is very effective for learning, and it is even fun. And yes, I promise I do other things in my life other than study for fun. Next piece of advice. Study ahead to get ahead. I'm going to blow your mind with this one. Let's say you're falling behind or you're struggling to keep up. First of all, we got to accept the truth. The reason you're falling behind is because whatever you are doing right now isn't enough for the pace it needs to be. And to stop falling behind, the easiest way is to get ahead. And you don't actually need to catch up to get ahead? And this is the mind-blowing thing for a lot of students. Imagine you're in a sinking ship. You don't need to get all the water out of the ship first before you plug the hole. In fact, that's illogical. You plug the hole first. It's the same thing with learning. If you're falling behind now, there's this backlog of stuff that you need to study and catch up on. You can keep chipping away at that debt of learning, but just make sure you're not accumulating more debt. And the reason that you're kind of a little screwed if you don't do this is because, remember, if you're falling behind or struggling to keep up, it means what you're doing now is not enough. So you will definitely keep falling behind. And if you've already got a debt and a backlog of stuff to chip away at, that's going to get larger, not smaller with time. And so as soon as you realize you're falling behind, you should at that point plug the leak. And one of the best and fastest ways to do that if you're short on time, which you probably are because you're falling behind, is to scope every subject to 10x your learning efficiency. I personally believe that no learning system can be called efficient if it doesn't involve scoping a subject before you learn it. So what do I mean by scoping a subject? It means going through what you're about to learn and getting a big picture overview of what it's talking about. What are the main ideas? What are the main groups of ideas? And how does it generally connect together? It's not about memorizing everything you need to memorize and all the new pieces of terminology and mastering it before you learn it in class or in lectures. It's just about getting enough of an idea about it that it feels a bit more familiar. And in learning science, this is called priming. And priming is a studying technique that has a very high correlation with learning. When you prime knowledge, it basically gives your brain context and relevance for what it's about to learn. You're telling it why it's important and where it maybe fits before you're telling it what it is. A great analogy is thinking about a library. Imagine you are the sole librarian of this huge library, and people are returning books that they've read. And you have to put these books away in the appropriate place. But you don't actually know how the library is organized. You don't know where the shelves are for which authors, for which genres. All you're getting is a pile of books coming at you every few minutes, and you desperately need to put those books in the right place. Imagine how hard that would be compared to if 15 minutes before your shift started, you went into the library and you generally got a sense of where the categories and what the shelving organization structure looks like. Now, when someone gives you the book and you look at it, you can think, yeah, this one belongs somewhere over there. And you may not know exactly where on the shelf it fits, but you know where the shelf is. It's the same thing for your brain. When you're learning something new, your brain's trying to figure out what it is and understand it. And it's also trying to decide, why is this relevant enough for me to spend energy on remembering and keeping this knowledge? Your brain isn't helping you pass an exam. Your brain is just trying to keep you alive. And it is a very energy-consuming organ, which means that if you're giving it random, irrelevant information that doesn't fit anywhere, your brain is going to aggressively remove it, because from your brain's perspective, it's a matter of life and death. And while there are many ways to prime your brain, just scoping the subject and getting a lay of the land is a really high-impact strategy that you can use that is going to have a noticeable difference on your memory and retention, as well as how deeply and easily you can understand new concepts. Next up, use cognitive load to delete passive learning. Cognitive load is the fancy term for mental effort. Effective learning always involves mental effort. Passive learning is the type of learning that doesn't involve high mental effort. And in fact, it's not really even learning. So rewriting notes is fairly passive if you're just writing it again word for word. Rereading things is also fairly passive. And different techniques on that spectrum of how much studying turns into learning have different levels of mental effort associated with them. And generally, the more effective ones have more mental effort. So, for example, creating summary pages is more effective, and then turning those summary pages into something that's non-linear and relational takes a little bit more effort. And then teaching it to a 10-year-old and simplifying those relationships and groups, that takes even more effort. And this is simply just because the learning is what happens in your brain. So your brain has to do thinking and processing to turn information into relevant knowledge. It takes effort. And the way we feel that mental exertion, that's what we call cognitive load. And now, not everything that has high cognitive load makes it effective. Like, for example, if all you wanted to do was max out your cognitive load, you can stand on one foot while you're juggling and someone's slapping you in the face with a fish while you read a textbook. Your cognitive load is going to be through the roof, but it's not going to make a difference to your learning. And so not all high cognitive load is effective learning, but all effective learning involves higher cognitive load. But whenever your cognitive load is low, you can know for sure that you're not engaging in effective learning. And so you want to be able to train yourself to be aware when you are studying, what's the level of mental exertion, cognitive load that I'm feeling? And if it's high, okay, that's fine, right? If it's low, there's a high likelihood that you're doing passive learning. And those need to be massive red flags that you look at and optimize, or just completely remove that out of your learning system. And in fact, you can even do a quick test. Have a study session for like 1 or 2 days, and then identify the techniques and the methods that you use where you feel that your brain is entering into that passive state. It's feeling boring, it's feeling tedious, it's feeling monotonous, you're kind of falling asleep and getting drowsy. Those are areas where your brain's basically falling asleep. Just try studying a topic without doing any of that stuff. Just literally remove it from your system. And you know what? You will probably find that there is no real difference to how much you learn. And you've saved that much time. And some of you will do this and be like, well, man, that's like 90% of all my studying feels like that. Surely my learning has gone down. Nope. It just means that 90% of the time you spent on studying was kind of a waste of time. And I'm saying that from the position where that used to be me. So much of my learning was passive, and it took me a very long time, longer than hopefully it will take you with my videos, to fix that and make it more active. Next up, these two are pretty juicy. Create analogies. An analogy, if you don't know, is just when you're comparing two different things to highlight how these things are similar to each other. Like, for example, if I say life is like a journey, then that's an analogy because I'm highlighting the similarities between life and a journey. And creating analogies is actually a great example of a technique that requires higher cognitive load. Because to create a good analogy, you have to look at two different concepts and compare them and look at how they're similar. And that takes effort. And that comparison, that process your brain undergoes to figure that out, that produces high quality learning. And actively forming analogies from what you're learning is a criminally underrated technique. So make analogies. And if you're already making analogies, then you can make them even better by critiquing those analogies. So let's say I take an analogy like life is a journey. Critiquing that means really examining the analogy that I've created to see how accurate and comprehensive it is. So I might say, okay, but life is also kind of not like a journey because life is more unpredictable. You don't know where you're headed, whereas with most journeys, you kind of know where the end point is and you can kind of map out what the path is going to be. So you might say, okay, so actually in that case, life is more like a spontaneous journey. And you might say, okay, well, but also life has more unpredictable elements, and sometimes you find yourself somewhere that you never intended to be, whereas with a journey, you can usually figure out where you want to go and then go there without too much complication. So you might say, okay, in that case, life is like a spontaneous journey through a foggy, treacherous forest mountain. Okay, you see what's going on is that the analogy is growing in order to be more comprehensive and accurate of whatever we're learning about. In this case, it happened to be life. And when you apply your brain in that way to critique an analogy and enhance it, It forces you to examine the information and the topic much more deeply and much more critically. And that also induces a higher level of cognitive load, which also translates through to a higher level of learning. And again, you can actually just test this. You can take 2 sets of concepts or 2 topics that you've just studied, make a really simple analogy for one of them, and don't critique it, and then make another analogy for the other topic, but then critique it, and then spend a bit of time really making that analogy more polished. Give yourself a week, and then see which topic you feel more confident on. 99 out of 100 times, the analogy you spend time on critiquing, your memory and your depth of understanding and the nuance to how you understand each of those individual parts is going to be deeper. And finally, keep a learning log. If you are serious about learning to learn, then you are going to be going through a journey, it's not quite a treacherous mountain forest, but it is a long process to really create a personalized learning system. And there are a lot of things about your habits and your processes and your techniques you're going to have to change. And it is impossible to change too many things at once. In fact, it's actually biologically impossible. Your brain has this maybe protective mechanism that's wired into it that stops it from changing too many things in a short period of time, which means that you can only really focus on changing 1 or 2 things at a time. And for learning, where there are like hundreds of factors that influence your ability to learn, it's going to take you a while. And at a certain point, and everyone who is serious about improving their learning is going to face this. You're going to become overwhelmed with the amount of things that you're trying to change and the experiments you're running and the mistakes that you're making in the trial and error. Keep a learning log. I so wish I kept a learning log 13 years ago when I first started my journey. Like that, those 3 years of improvement, I probably could have done that in like 9 months if I kept a learning log that tracks what am I testing, what do I think is going to make a difference, what technique am I trying today, how did that go, what am I going to do tomorrow. If I just kept iterating that with more focus instead of just doing this thing and then this thing and then this thing and this thing and then coming back to the first thing, then it would have been so much faster and so much easier for me to improve. But I didn't because I was lazy, basically, and I couldn't be bothered keeping a learning log. I just didn't think it was going to be necessary until it was too late. In fact, it's so important that all of the students that I train now through I Can Study, like a learning log and a reflective record is like one of the actual techniques that I teach now. It just makes a huge difference, and it helps enormously with motivation to see the progress that you're making that you can't necessarily see on the surface. And so being able to look through your learning log and realize like, man, the stuff I used to think about and worry about and how I thought about learning like a month ago is completely different to how I understand it now. That's really motivating. So please make your life easier. Keep a learning log. So that's my advice. And honestly, I can do like 100 more of these because 13 years, this is a long time to just be learning about learning. And I've picked up a lot of these lessons along the way. If you enjoyed this format, please let me know. If you want me to do more of this, again, let me know. And if you want to learn a little bit more about some of the techniques you can start applying to work on the things that I've talked about, then check out this video here to help you on the next step of your learning journey.